very, very delighted to have the United States Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, join us today. He's been on a busy, busy schedule, just back from the G20. I'm sure he's familiar to so many of you. Former governor of Iowa, served for 8 years as Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama. He then served as President and CEO of the United States Dairy Export Council, and we were very fortunate to have him speak to us virtually last year as well when he was serving in that capacity. So, Mr. Secretary, on behalf of the about 350 people who are joining us both online and here in the room in Kansas City, we'd like to welcome you and thank you for joining us for your opening remarks. Welcome.
Well, Sarah, thank you very much, and really appreciate the opportunity to be with everyone this morning. As Sarah indicated, I just returned from Florence, Italy, a 3-day event where the agricultural ministers and representatives from the G20 appeared and conferred for a number of days. It was important for the United States to be there in Italy to have this conversation, simply because there are now a number of key events that will occur in the next couple of weeks that I think have a direct bearing on the direction of agriculture globally into the future. As you may know, we have a UN Food Systems Summit coming up next week, and following that, shortly after that, is COP26, which will be in Scotland, where the world will come together to talk about climate and the impact and effect that climate is having on agriculture, and steps that will be taken in order to address the impact, both in terms of adaptation and mitigation, and also in terms of how things need to be structured to reduce emissions connected to agriculture, so that we're in the process of responding to what is a growing desire on the part of the marketplace for ultimately a net zero emission agriculture. So it was important for me to be there in Florence because our European friends, as you know, have a new common agricultural policy, which they commonly refer to as Farm to Fork, and their member countries are now in the process of implementing that new common agricultural policy. It's a policy that is really focused on transitioning significantly and transforming the way in which they provide subsidies and help to farmers across the EU in exchange for environmental good practices. We wanted to make sure that the world understood that there was a consensus on the ultimate goal, which is to, in fact, get to a net zero emission agriculture by the year 2050, simply because the market demands it. But understanding that there were multiple and different ways to obtain that goal. The EU has chosen one way. We in the United States believe that a market-oriented, incentive-based, voluntary system is effective and will be effective to get us to the same destination. So it was important and necessary for us to voice that alternative, and then to seek, as I did in bilateral discussions with a number of agricultural ministers, the beginnings of a coalition of nations that feel as we do, that voluntary, market-based, science-driven approaches to climate will result ultimately in us reaching the goal of net zero emissions. I had a very good, solid conversation with my counterpart in Brazil, for example, where I think both of us understand and appreciate that we can't let our European friends basically dominate this conversation and basically suggest that there's a single way to get to this ultimate goal. We also wanted to make sure that people understood and appreciated that this, whatever system we utilize in ultimately getting to this goal, should not be used as a barrier to trade. We wanted to make sure that the message about the openness and the transparency of trade relationships need to continue. And so that goal, I think, was achieved. I think we are in the process of beginning to develop coalitions. We also look forward to adding to a number of nations that have already committed to the agriculture innovation mission for climate, Aim for C, which is going to be sort of launched at the UN Food Summit system in terms of encouraging people to join, countries to join this coalition, and then ultimately formally announced, if you will, at the COP26. The United States and the United Arab Emirates are leading this effort to secure a number of countries to participate in this coalition, and I think we already have somewhere between 10 and 15 countries that have already made a commitment to be part of this effort, and that too was a goal of mine in discussions with representatives from Spain and Italy and again Brazil, as well as individual conversations I had with other ministers, encouraging them to participate. The Japanese minister, for example, was also a seatmate at one of our lunch meetings, and I had the opportunity to make and extend the invitation to him as well. So it's I think, an important forum for us to have leadership position, and I think it was appreciated that I made the effort to get to Italy. On the issue of exports, as you know, we are projecting for fiscal year 21 that ends this month a record export year, significantly higher than the previous export year that was set in record year that was set in 2014. We expect and anticipate and project potentially the record set this year will also be surpassed next year. Key, obviously, to exports in terms of agriculture is our continued relationship with China. And I think it's fair to say that while we recognize that China has indeed increased its commitments and increased its purchases over the last several years as a result of the Phase 1 agreement, that they have not yet actually met the requirements of Phase 1, and I think it's expected and anticipated that we'll continue to press China for meeting their promised levels of sales and transactions. You know, this is an incredibly complex relationship, and I think it's sometimes easy for those who are in a particular industry, whether it's agriculture or any other industry, to look at this in a very microscopic way, focusing simply on our particular interests or our particular industry. But the reality is the relationship with China has multiple layers and multiple levels. It has a national security level. It has a climate security level. It has a trade level. It has an economic competition level. It has a global leadership level where we are articulating the belief that a democratic approach to governance in the 21st century is a more effective and more efficient way of governing people that establishes and protects a certain level of liberty and freedom. The Chinese government making the case that an authoritative government approach in this 21st century a year and time of change is a more appropriate role for governments to assume. So we're involved in a multiple level complex relationship with China, and every piece of that relationship impacts and affects every other piece of that relationship. And it's not a simple thing to put together how to approach China as you consider the approach to China in trade, as you consider the approach to China on climate change, as you consider the approach to China on the security of nations in the South China Sea, the freedoms and liberties of those who live in Hong Kong, or minorities who reside in China. So it's important for us to continue to press China on Phase 1. It's important for us to understand as well the complexity of this relationship. We'll continue to reach out to a number of agricultural ministers on the export side. I'll again have another conversation with Secretary Vilsack here in the near future. I expect to participate with him and the Canadian minister pending the elections at the World Food Prize, where we can have a continued conversation about the implementation of USMCA. Looking forward to Mexico finalizing once and for all its access to potatoes for U.S. potato access into their market. It's been a 14 to 15 year struggle to get that done. We continue to press them on issues relating to GE corn, and some of the other issues that have cropped up in this relationship. We also continue, obviously, to have conversations with our Canadian friends. Again, elections have a tendency to make those conversations a bit more complex, but our trade representative, Ambassador Tai, has proceeded with the consultation that is a prerequisite to additional steps under the USMCA for enforcement, and we are certainly supportive of that effort on the dairy side. Good news coming out of Vietnam. A number of tariffs have been reduced. A number of SPS barriers to our products have been reduced, which allows us to encourage more trade with that important country. And recently, the EU did require and allow us to have a bit more time in order to satisfy their health certificate for livestock. We were deeply concerned that that might impact and affect about $1.5 billion of livestock sales in the EU. We continue to work with them to make sure that that health certificate is something that is doable and practical in terms of our relationship and our trade relationship. I know that everyone's interested in the undersecretary position, nobody more so than I am. We have several candidates that we're in the process, I think the final process of looking at, and both of the candidates that I know we are looking at are people that are well familiar with trade, and I think people that will be able to get the kind of support necessary to get through the confirmation process. And I realize that my senator, Senator Grassley, has encouraged us to do this. I would also sort of push back on the senator a little bit and encourage him to help us get the holds that are on a number of Biden-Harris conferees lifted in the Senate so that we can get a full complement of people at work at USDA and other departments throughout the government. We've only had one undersecretary up to this point confirmed. We've got a number of them pending in the Senate, and we have a number in the Senate Ag Committee that are awaiting a vote. Hopefully that process speeds up. Let me talk briefly about drought assistance. It's something that we are deeply concerned about. Since nearly all of Western U.S. is impacted and affected, 95% of the Western states now have drought conditions that are D2, D3, or D4. We're looking for creative ways to expand significantly the help and assistance. Most recently, we announced a permanent change to our Emergency Livestock Honeybee and Farm Fish Assistance Program, ELAP. We now are making it available not only to provide assistance and help to reduce the cost of water hauling, but we also understand and appreciate that a number of producers across the country will be spending a significant amount of money to be able to transport feed. More than 25 miles from home, less than 1,000 miles from their operation. We're now going to try to provide assistance in the form of roughly 60% of the reimbursement of the cost of that feed. For some producers, it could be as high as 90% reimbursement. We're going to start with an average of about $6.60 per mile, and then we're going to just basically take a look and see how we might be able to provide additional adjustments based on regional differences that may exist. This is for livestock producers that are raising livestock for haying and grazing. We're looking at other ways in which we could potentially use some of the tools we have at USDA to provide additional help and assistance for other livestock producers. We, as you know, recently announced a fairly significant amount of assistance and help for our dairy producers, a little over $1 billion, almost $1.2 billion in assistance and help, which has been part of about $11 billion of announcements and disbursements that we've made under the pandemic assistance and Build Back Better efforts at USDA. Most recently focused on contract growers who didn't receive adequate compensation under the previous COVID programs, as well as looking at the processing industry, some of the ag workers who had to incur expense during the onset of COVID, and as I said, our dairy operators. Just a couple more comments, and then I'll turn it over to questions if that's appropriate. I know there's a lot of interest in the biofuel industry, and obviously all of us are waiting for the EPA to finalize and to decide the RFS limits. But in the meantime, we have been working with the Department of Energy, the EPA, and others to begin the process of developing a new industry, if you will, which is in the aviation fuel. We recently announced the Grand Challenge of Aviation Fuel Challenge, designed initially to generate 3 billion gallons of bio-based 100% drop-in aviation fuel by the year 2030, which will help reduce airline emissions, particularly for long international flights, by roughly 20%. As you may know, the air industry represents about 11% of our transportation emissions. And I think it's likely that we're going to continue to see a real push to ultimately develop an aviation fuel that meets a bio-based aviation fuel that meets the entire need for the aviation industry, which is about a 35 billion gallon industry opportunity by the year 2050. The USDA is engaged in a number of projects focused on feedstock analysis and feedstock development. The Department of Energy has announced a series of additional resources for projects, which could ultimately amount to a little over $4 billion of assistance and help. The Build Back Better reconciliation bill currently contains a fairly significant tax credit that will also help to fuel, no pun intended, this industry. So it's a complement to the light transportation assistance that we currently have under the RFS with cars and trucks, and confident that we're going to continue to need a significant amount of biofuel in the future, particularly as we increase mileage standards. It's going to require higher octane. You get that higher octane through biofuels. Let me stop there. Happy to talk about conservation and climate, which I anticipate and expect there may be some questions on that, and any other issue that folks may have. Sara?
Thank you, Secretary Vilsack. You covered a lot of territory there, and we really appreciate the updates as you've come back from the G20. Just a reminder to everybody, please submit your questions via Slido. Several have come in already, but I'd like to start and just see if you could elaborate a little bit more on your Productivity Coalition. As we reported last week, you had these discussions with Brazil, and you elaborated on that a little bit, but what do you see as the engagement and opportunity with some of the African countries with the productivity focus?
Well, that's an opportunity that may arise during the UN Food Assistance Summit and the COP26, where we have an opportunity to talk to a number of those African nations. There was some representation from Africa during the course of the G20, but my focus initially was making sure that we sort of begin the process in our own hemisphere, if you will, because there's going to be significant effort on the part of our friends in the EU to basically suggest that there's a single way to do this. And I think, frankly, when you talk to ag ministers from individual member countries of the EU, they will tell you they have obviously concerns, and their farmers have expressed concerns about whether or not what they're approaching, what they're doing in terms of transitioning and rapidly transitioning the assistance and help. The UK minister indicated to me that they are going to shift completely their entire support system towards a focus solely on conservation and climate within the next 3 to 5 years, which is a very, very, very rapid shift. And I think there's some deep concern. So what we want to be able to do is to offer an alternative to the world, and to offer the alternative that at the end of the day, we have two challenges here. We have to meet the needs, the food needs of a growing world population, but we need to do it in a way that is climate smart and climate friendly and reduces emissions, because in developed countries, and particularly in many of our trading partners, there is an increased demand on the part of their consumers for sustainably produced product. So you've got these two pressures, if you will, continued demand and being able to do it in a way with the climate changing and creating the kinds of situations that we're confronting in the western part of the U.S. today. And that's just, that's going to be the way of life, if you will. And so how do we do this? Well, I think what we tried to convince and what we tried to convey in the meetings was the fact that you can't restrict productivity. You have to figure out through innovation, through technology, through gene editing, through precision agriculture, through a variety of technologies, you need to figure out a way to do more with less. And I'm, for one, not, I am totally confident we're able to do that. And we'll be able to do that. We've always been able to do that. And that's just the nature of agriculture. Where there's a problem, we usually figure out a way to fix it. And in this particular circumstance, it's a problem pretty significant. And it's going to require a lot of investment. It's going to require a change of thinking on the part of a lot of folks. And it's going to require assistance and from government that reduces the risk to the producer, because we can't put the burden of doing all of these changes solely on the farmer, because the farmer already has a difficult time making ends meet. We can't make it more difficult. We actually have to reduce that risk so we get acceptance. And so our coalition is really designed to focus on to the world the argument that you have to increase more, that you can increase more with innovation and technology, and that farmers should not bear the responsibility, the financial responsibility, and the risk associated with that financial responsibility of doing all of this, that it really is up to society to provide the resources to enable farmers to do what they need to do for them in turn to be able to produce what needs to be produced to feed a hungry world. I think on the Africa side, we have some challenges there because we don't have the relationships that we perhaps have in other parts of the world in terms of agriculture. The EU has been pretty aggressive for many years in the space of trade and activity with the African countries, and in fact, the EU colonized a number of those countries, and so there is a connection, if you will. So it is important for us to look for ways to build capacity, to build relationships, and I think that's one of the reasons why the discussions continue with Kenya on some kind of trade agreement that would make it would be the beginning, if you will, of a foothold in that continent for us to be able to make the case to them that our system of productivity gain, our system of innovation and technology is the way to go. The one thing I would say, Sarah, and I'll finish with this, the one positive note that I got out of this meeting from the standpoint of listening to the EU representatives and the member countries is a understanding and appreciation, at least from their perspective, of a potential acceptance of gene editing far significantly more positive than with genetically modified crops. And so I think there is a recognition that we need to embrace the science, and we need to figure out how to make sure consumers are aware and everything's transparent, but the consumers are brought along as this science evolves. And so I thought that was a positive indication from our EU friends that they recognize it's going to have to be more productivity at the end of the day, and technology is going to play a significant role.
Thank you. Actually, one of our questioners had asked about the fact that we realize the Food and Drug Administration has been reluctant to approve new animal biotech products, but you've expressed an interest in others of advancing the regulatory structure for these innovations. Can you give us an update on where that kind of stands and any discussions between USDA and FDA on how we can get some approvals?
It's interesting you asked that question because last week I received a notice that the FDA had reached out to us to find out a way in which we could begin more concrete conversations about how to move this process along. I think they finally realize that if we're going to get serious about climate, for example, there was a joint announcement on methane emissions. And there's a recognition, obviously, that we've got to do more in terms of methane reduction and capture and reuse. Well, you can't do methane reduction unless you figure out ways in which you can provide whatever is necessary to add to feed or to change feed or to change ratios to be able to reduce the methane. And part of that involves an FDA that understands and appreciates that we're not talking about some kind of pharmaceutical application. We're talking about literally a feed additive that ought to be treated a little bit differently from a perspective of a regulatory review. And so I think there is now a better recognition because there is so much focus on climate and recognizing that methane is a critical component of this. I think FDA is now more open than they have been to conversations. And hopefully that leads to not only them speeding up their current process, but encouraging them to think differently and to think broadly. And frankly, all of us have to do this. I've talked to our team at USDA. The tools that we have are well suited for the challenges of the 20th century. And I'm not sure how well suited they are for the 21st century. And a good example is the way in which we've had to kind of jerry-rig drought assistance. Kind of figuring out how to extend this program or that program. It seems to me that we really need to have some thought about how you deal with mega droughts, how you deal with weather patterns and circumstances that are not temporary, not just a drought that lasts a couple of months or 6 months or lasts one growing season, but something that impacts multiple growing seasons. I think we're going to be dealing with something like that. And I think as we approach the 2023 Farm Bill, we got to think about that.
Yes, 2023 is going to be here before we know it, and I'm sure that we'll be talking a lot about the next Farm Bill. We've got several people who have asked about increased funding for land grants for both facilities and research, and I know that you've long been a champion of research, and we also saw the House Ag Committee and their markup of the reconciliation bill give dramatically more money for research. We don't know, of course, where that will ultimately end up. But can you provide any updates on what's happening around this whole sphere of increased investments for ag research facilities?
Well, the good news is that President Biden understands and appreciates the importance and value of research, and understands and appreciates we're not going to get to where we need to be in terms of the challenges we face without a significant amount of research. And that's why in his 2022 budget, which is a one-year commitment, we saw a significant increase the president proposed, and both the House and the Ag Senate committees have acknowledged the need to increase funding on both the capacity and the research side for our land-grant universities, as well as our minority-serving institutions. And so that, I think when you see it in the budget, then you know that there is a genuine desire to get something done, and I think you're going to see more resources. The reconciliation bill is obviously a challenge. This is a big lift. Again, it's easy for folks to focus on one aspect of the bill that they like or don't like without taking a look at the totality of the need and the totality of the opportunity. You know, for agriculture, it may be that there are deep concerns about the way in which this is paid for, but the reality is there's not as much discussion as to the benefits that agriculture will specifically, directly receive as a result of this. When you talk about research, that's one aspect of it. When you talk about improving the transportation system, I can't tell you how many times I've heard farm groups tell me the necessity of improving lock and dam systems, the ability to improve our rail system, the ability to improve our roads and bridges to be able to get product to market. That's a terrific advantage that we have and have had historically in terms of exports. We're able to sell our exports, get our exports to market more efficiently, and the result is we have a cost advantage. But that cost advantage is shrinking over time because other nations are investing significantly in their own infrastructure because they get it. We have got to fix our infrastructure. There's just no question about that. And the reconciliation bill and the infrastructure bill, whether we like it or not, they're tied at the hip. They're joined at the hip. And you don't get one and not the other. You got to get them both, or you don't get any of them. And that's a challenge right now. So there's research, there's transportation. I'm absolutely convinced there's going to be significant resources in conservation. So you put those three together, and the aviation biofuels and new market opportunities, additional resource for bio-based manufacturing in some of the rural development components, and all of a sudden you've got a tremendous investment in new markets and new ways to get product to market. I'm not sure why we're all not trying to figure out how to get our friends in Congress to get this done and to get it done quickly so we can get these resources to work as quickly as possible.
Well, we certainly heard a lot about the need for investments in infrastructure, and we've been living this personally of having a bridge condemned in a farm in North Dakota that, you know, people, this is a real life situation, whether it's a rural road, a rural bridge, locks and dams, as you mentioned. We've got some other questions about trade that are coming in, and certainly we know that the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, is the lead on negotiating new agreements, but folks are wondering what can they expect as we continue to see this growing export opportunity. Can we expect some new trade deals to be negotiated, or perhaps involvement with the CPTPP that we weren't involved in the past? Or will it be more of a, let's just make sure that like USMCA and some of the existing trade agreements are working better? What can you tell folks here to expect on the trade front from your vantage point?
Well, I think there are a couple of things. I think first and foremost, we've got to make sure that we get our China relationship where it needs to be. And I think that's a priority. Why is it a priority? Because obviously a significant amount of our export activity recently has occurred in China. And when we had the trade dispute with China, we saw a pretty significant downturn in commodity prices, and it was a pretty difficult time for farmers. So I think it is incumbent on us to get that relationship where it needs to be, and to make sure that folks understand, folks here and there, understand the necessity of two major nations being able to compartmentalize, if you will, their relationship. I mentioned earlier the complexity. Well, that complexity creates the need for the ability to sort of compartmentalize, to understand that while there may be differences on one side of the relationship, there are opportunities on the other side that need to be taken full advantage of. And part of that compartmentalization is making sure that people live up to the agreements that they've made. And I think what we will likely see is an effort to make sure that China understands that it's our expectation, and it should be their expectation, that they live up to the agreements that they made. Now, once you have that relationship firmed up, and once you have it, I think you can then begin the process of knowing how all of that fits into approaches that you can make to either multilateral or bilateral trade relations. I think it also is incumbent upon us to make sure that the USMCA works. It is a model now, right? It is in theory, it was supposed to be the new trade agreement. Well, let's see if it works. If it works, then it's a lesson that can be then applied as we try to inject ourselves in conversations with individual nations or multilateral nations. I think it's incumbent over time. I think we want to engage, obviously, in Southeast Asia because it's a growing market opportunity. And while we're sort of getting our feet on the ground, and she still just recently announced, finally got approval to proceed with a ag trade counselor in her office. So as we're getting our feet on the ground, it seems to me the focus on China, the focus on implementation of UMCA is the right way to go. And as you sort of see how all that works, then you're in a position to be able to figure out, well, how do we inject ourselves in other trade relations or other trade negotiations? And I think Southeast Asia is a critically important one long term. And I think you mentioned Africa. I think there's an opportunity there long term for us to engage in Africa. So this is, I think, I think it requires a bit of patience, and I think it requires an understanding of the priority or the way in which you have to get this thing figured out. If you rush into a conversation in Southeast Asia, it could potentially impact your discussions with China. And what you want to do is you want to get the best of both worlds. You want to get China to live up to its full responsibilities under phase one, and then you want eventually to learn how best to restructure trade agreements in the future to meet the labor, the environmental, and all the other issues that you have to discuss in the context of a trade agreement.
So one of the questions also that has come up along that area is something that you had mentioned is the opportunity for biofuels. And we know that the Sustainable Aviation Fuel initiative that you mentioned is really exciting for a lot of people who think that both soybeans and corn can be involved in this arena. Maybe not so positive for some of the bakers and some of the others who are worried about potential negative impacts. But as you look at the biofuel strategy for the Biden administration, some of our questioners are asking whether or not there's an integrated strategy now. I mean, is it a whole of government trying to say, here's all the other things we can do to advance biofuels, or is like the sustainable aviation fuel now, is that going to be the next big thing and maybe not as much focus on the RFS? Or how do you see that situation playing out?
Well, I appreciate the way in which you've asked that question because I think it's an important one. And I think it allows me to reassure people that there is a genuine understanding and appreciation for the role that biofuels plays in a variety of issues that have mattered to the Biden-Harris administration. I know, Sarah, you hear it, I hear it. People say, well, there's always talk about electric vehicles. Well, of course there's talk about electric vehicles because that's kind of a new thing. And there's no question that the world and we are moving towards electric vehicles. But the question is, do we want to be last in that, or do we want to be a leader? Do we want to control the market or be controlled by the market? So naturally, there's a conversation about EVs, but the reality of EVs is it's going to take a long time for that to happen. And in the meantime, you're going to need biofuel, right? You're just absolutely going to need biofuel. So the fact that the Aviation Challenge includes the Department of Transportation, EPA, the Department of Energy, and the Department of Agriculture, and the FAA, all suggest, I believe, that this is in fact a whole of government approach. That is also true of some of the underlying aspects. I mean, there's a good relationship we have with the EPA on the issue of waivers. I think Administrator Reagan absolutely understands you can't set the bar for the RFS at a high level and then sort of deconstruct it or destroy that high level with granting waivers to just about anybody who asks for them. The waiver process is really designed solely for those small refineries that are just having a really difficult time. It's not to be used, generously. It's to be used very judiciously. And Administrator Reagan understands that, and I think is on record to saying that's the way his EPA, the Biden-Harris EPA, is going to operate. Then, secondly, there's the issue of research. We're constantly looking for ways in which we can research to reduce emissions from connected to biofuels, so that we have that low carbon alternative. Again, when I mentioned this earlier, when you raise mileage standards, which the EPA is doing, that in essence is an indication to the biofuel industry. Hey, we recognize your importance because we know the only way to get those higher standards is through higher octane. And you get the higher octane through biofuels. So there's a lot of activity in this space that doesn't get the headlines because we've been doing it for a while. I mean, it's hard to get the press to write about something you've been doing for 5 years or 10 years or 15 years. It's much easier to get the press interested in something that's new and shiny. But it doesn't mean that you've forgotten about the other industries. You continue to provide the support. And I think you're going to continue to see that. And I think you're going to see from the administration, more transparency, more honesty, if you will, in the whole process, which I think provides greater stability and greater predictability, which I think is important as well. You can't have a standard and people rely on it, and then through a series of waivers, you basically cut the legs out from under that standard, and it creates instability. And the fact that we're in the process of trying to go through the approval process of getting the $700 million of additional assistance and help to the biofuel industry is another indication of support. The fact that we just recently announced some additional money for infrastructure to get the distribution systems, the pumping systems that provide for greater access to higher blends, that's an indication of support. I know that the EPA continues to work on a variety of other issues relative to higher blends. So when you take a look at the totality of everything, it seems to me that that you see a whole of government approach. You see a consistency and a transparency and a support level that's predictable, that's honest, and that's real. But you don't see the headlines because it's just difficult to get headlines on stuff you're constantly doing all the time.
So just one follow-up to that, if I may, just a little bit more detail, and that is that, as you know, legislation moving through Congress that could potentially keep corn and soybeans out of being eligible for the Sustainable Aviation Fuels credit. Can we expect the administration to weigh in, perhaps support inclusion of corn and soybeans in that?
Well, the fact that the Grand Challenge focused on the work that we're doing at the Department of Agriculture in terms of feedstocks, I would hope would indicate and suggest to people that in fact that is the administration's position, that we are working on a wide variety. This is this isn't going to, the reality is you want to make sure that when you create a new industry, that you provide opportunities in every part of the country to participate. Now, is it going to be corn and soybeans only? No, it's not. There's a woody biomass need and demand that in the western part of the United States. We have a tremendous amount of hazardous fuel that's built up over decades in our forests. We're seeing the consequence of that. And you say, well, that's not agriculture's fault, or that's not agriculture's interest. Well, yeah, it is. Here's why it's in interest. Because number one, those fires are massive. There is, a lot of indication of smoke damage associated with crops as a result of those fires. When forests are burning up, they can't do the job that they have to do as being conservers of water resources. And in a part of the country where water is really important to agriculture, we want to utilize every possible opportunity to preserve and conserve every drop of water. We need healthy forests to do that. So, when we use hazardous fuel buildup as a woody biomass as a feedstock for aviation, it doesn't mean that we're turning our back on corn and soybeans. It means that we're trying to make sure that this is an industry that has relevance, if you will, in all parts of the country. And at the end of the day, I think that's important.
Mr. Secretary, you mentioned some of the kind of back and forth on getting nominees confirmed, getting them through the Senate, and of course, getting them so they are nominated, first of all, with your Undersecretary for Trade. What some folks have been asking also, what about the boots on the ground people, the Farm Service Agency folks, the rural development folks, the NRCS folks, state by state, the political nominees? I know that, in our writing on this, the Biden administration is ahead of where the Trump administration was at this time, but it's still behind where you were in the previous Obama administration. So what can we expect in terms of getting those state offices filled?
I think you're going to see a number of those offices being filled very, very soon. I would anticipate and expect that a significant number of them will be filled during late September and into October. That's coming. I've seen slates of a number of states of folks that the president's considering. So I think that's coming. And in terms of boots on the ground, our focus at USDA has been, as important as those political folks are, in my view, the really important folks are the folks in those offices, those NRCS people who are actually out on the farm helping farmers. And we came into a department that saw a significant downturn in terms of the number of people employed, and we are significantly ramping up and hiring additional folks to get more, as you say, boots on the ground. And with the president's 2022 budget, we'll be able to significantly accelerate that process. We're going to need those people if we're going to be trying to provide the help to farmers to embrace climate smart agricultural practices and to utilize any additional resources that may be coming for that purpose. And so there are three levels here. The actual boots on the ground that work with farmers, there's the political appointees at the state, and then there's the political appointees that work with me. And we need to do all three. And I want to make sure people understand that we are focused on all three. This is an administration, Sarah, that has a very high ethics standard, very high. When you have a high ethics standard, sometimes it unfortunately disqualifies folks from participating because they just can't work their way around the ethics requirements. But on the other hand, you want to make sure that you've got an ethical government. I would hope that that's a shared belief on a part of everyone.
Thank you. So, Secretary Vilsack, we've just got about 3 minutes left. I know your time is very valuable, so I wanted to give you the last word to make any closing comments before we wrap.
Well, I want to reassure folks who are listening today and who are in attendance that we are listening, and we've listened very, very carefully on this issue of climate. And we've heard some really good advice from farmers and ranchers and those who represent farmers and ranchers on how best to structure an approach that would be most accepted at the local level. And I think you will see coming up very, very shortly as we make some announcements in this space that we listened. and that we're responding to the concerns that are out there. And I'm hopeful that people recognize that because this, we recognize how incredibly challenging the situation is for farmers. I've been mentioning the fact that so many farms today don't generate the majority of their income from the farming operation, which requires off-farm income. That's why we're focused on more new and better markets. It's why exports are important, why local and regional food systems are important, why additional processing capacity is important. That's all stuff we're hearing from people on the ground saying this is what we want. And we've been pretty aggressive. If you take a look at the totality of things that we've announced and the amount of money that we've provided, I think it's fair to say we've been fairly aggressive during the first 7-8 months of this administration. We're going to continue that aggressive approach, but we're going to do it in a way that is responsive to what we've heard from folks on the ground. They've been very, very helpful, and I think you'll see that in how we structure things going forward.
Thank you, Secretary Vilsack. Let's show him our appreciation with a nice round of applause.